Okay, so we'll go on ahead and get started. We have Micah Weedman here, who will be facilitating this panel. He is an instructional designer at Yavapai College, hired solely to support the grant. He comes with lots of experience. And we have 5 dedicated faculty to OER and the OER movement. We have Kylie Becker from Eastern Arizona, Kate Kozak from Coconino Community College, Tara O'Neill from Yavapai College, Karen Palmer and Sandy Van Loo also from Yavapai College. So thank you so much to all for sharing your experience and expertise with OER. We're so happy to have you here. And I'm going to go on ahead and pass it off to Micah to go on ahead and facilitate this session.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And hello to everyone. This is always such an exciting thing to talk about, and so inspiring to listen to everybody. And I'm very excited to hear from faculty. So let's jump right in and do this. I'm wondering if we couldn't just go person by person and hear from every faculty person on a panel, just a general introduction, who you are, where you teach, what you teach, and maybe if you want to jump straight into also, how did you get started with OER, or what was your initial draw into the world of OER, and then we'll just kind of go from there, if you don't mind. So why don't we start with Kylie, if that's okay. I'll go ahead and pick the person to start with, and then we'll just kind of go around, figuratively speaking.
Hello, my name is Kylie Becker. I am the communication professor here at Eastern Arizona College over in Thatcher. So hi, everybody. In regards to like OER and how I got started, like I put in the chat earlier, my mother's been a librarian for pretty much all of my life. So I've always been within like the educational field and community, and, you know, just was growing up taught with the belief that, you know, you're in a library all the time. You need to make sure that no matter what you do, information is accessible to all, and that it's easily accessible, because, you know, that's the point of a library. You share information, you help facilitate learning. And then, of course, you know, being an instructor and working at the same institution as my mother did, she started our little OER project here at EA. And now I've just kind of taken it over and teamed up with you guys. But pretty much all of my courses at this point that I teach are all OER. And what was the other question, Micah?
No, I think that covered it exactly. So we're just getting started on some stuff. So that's great. Thanks so much, Kylie.
Okay, thank you.
Kate, how about we go next to you and go ahead and just introduce yourself and what you teach, and what was your initial attraction to OER?
All right, so I teach mathematics at Coconino Community College in Flagstaff, Arizona. I've been teaching there for 28 years, I think it is now. And I got started in OER for a couple of reasons. One was that I got tired of telling my students, well, the definition in the book is not really the definition I use. This is the definition I use, and having to get that information out to them. I also was tired of seeing a textbook. I taught physics one semester, and they went to a new edition, and I couldn't find changes in the textbook until like page 500 and something. So it bothered me that my students are paying. I mean, I teach also different equations, and my textbook in that class was like $200. And I felt bad that my students were paying that kind of money for these textbooks. So I started looking for writing OER books. Mostly I started with my statistics class, and then my department then wrote one for our liberal arts math class. So that's kind of how we got started into this. We don't have all of our courses in that fashion yet, but we're working on getting more of our courses into OER, or at least more affordable textbooks.
That's great. Thanks so much. Dr. O'Neill, how about you next?
You said Dr. O'Neill, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, okay. I recently graduated, so I'm still not quite used to that. Doctora. Anyway, I started, well, I teach elementary and early childhood courses. I started looking into OER more when our vice president, Dr. Ryan, encouraged us to do so. And as a student, I remember buying lots of books that I never used, that the instructor didn't require us to read all of. I drugged them around for years thinking I would reference them, and I never did. And just overall in education, in K-12 world and even early childhood, we are constantly sharing lesson plans and materials. And so it just feels really natural, especially when, you know, like all of the classes in all of the community colleges in Arizona are creating courses to meet DES requirements and like health, safety, nutrition. So why aren't we creating things that we can share if it's all really, really similar stuff? And then at ATF meetings for both ECE and EDU, people were really open to sharing and taking on different roles and creating things. And then I found a lot of great stuff. That was really the main thing that made me start creating OER courses, is I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. There's, and I think we'll probably talk about this more later, but a group out of College of the Canyons that's already in California that's already created a lot of great stuff that we can use. So, and then as I was working on my doctorate through GCU, there weren't any required textbooks. And that was just a whole nother step that I didn't have to worry about. And it was really convenient to not, you know, have to have materials prepared. And we also went to 8 weeks sessions at Yavapai. Not all of our classes are 8 weeks, but asking students to order and hunt down books every 8 weeks can get really, you know, just tricky. And then they would come to class without their textbooks, and then they'd be back ordered. And then we're 2 weeks into an 8 week session, and then they're way behind, they're a month behind. So I think OER has been really great. We don't have all of our classes OER yet, but we have a decent chunk of them.
That's great. Thank you so much. Dr. Palmer, how about we go to you next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Palmer. I teach English at Yavapai. And I think, gosh, my OER journey, I didn't even know what OER really was. I didn't hear the term until, like Tara said, Dr. Ryan introduced it to us at a convocation. But even well before that, I was really concerned about the cost of textbooks for my students. And so I started teaching back in '99. And so one of my first full-time experiences was at Grand Canyon. And back when I was in school at Grand Canyon, we had to buy the Little Brown Handbook. I'm sure anyone in here who's English or took composition at some point had to have that book. And so, of course, that was one of the books I had to have my students read. Well, I had my old version because, like Tara, I lug my books around everywhere. You can see some of them behind me. And I was like, wait a second, this is the exact same thing. Why in the world do students have to buy a new one? And, you know, back in the early 2000s, Amazon wasn't like at their fingertips. And so I would tell my students, okay, go to the library. The schools always have your books in the library. You can check them out, or, you know, look for an older version. If you can find an older version, you just have to look for the page numbers. So I was trying to help them. I had tried at one point, just in my literature class, my English 102 class, we still focus on literature at Yavapai, and just trying to link to the different stories and poems and things so that if students didn't have the book, because I had the same experience as Tara, they wouldn't have the book, and it's 2 weeks into the class or 4 weeks into the class, and you can't, you know, you have to have the book. You have to read the stories if you want to have a good discussion about them and be able to understand them to write about them. So that's when I first started looking into it. When I heard that OER, what I ended up doing is writing 3 textbooks for my classes. So I have a textbook for English 101 and 102. I teach an intro to rhetoric class. There was nothing for that. So I pulled together all of the resources for that class and created a textbook for that. And then I teach a women in literature class, and there was nothing for that. So I pulled in all of my, you know, resources for that. And what's really awesome is, like, I think Catherine said, students, the book is me. It's my voice. So I have a student who I had, you know, have had for several semesters consecutively. And she said, I can hear your voice in this book. I love it. And so that was a real win for me, is that they got to, the content they were reading matched with what I was teaching. I didn't have to, you know, finagle things to make it match. All of us who have taught before know what that's like. You get a new textbook and you have to take what you either think what you teach, or you have to match it to the textbook, and then you don't use all the textbook. And students read everything in the textbook because everything in the textbook applies to the class. So I have some new classes coming down the line, and I'll be creating more textbooks for those too. And I just use Pressbooks. It's really easy for my students to access those materials. So
All right, it looks like we may have gotten hung up there. So let's go ahead and go to our final panelist, Dr. Van Loo, if you wouldn't mind to jump in.
Yeah, no worries. Dr. Palmer kind of lives out in the boonies in Camp Verde, and so her Wi-Fi is usually unstable, but she got through most of it. Yeah, so I was very similar in that I had a couple of years of college where I couldn't afford textbooks, and so I would borrow them from teachers or libraries. And then when I started teaching, I remember I had no choice. I was handed a textbook and told, this is what you're using when you teach at our school. And so I didn't have an option of how much it cost. And later, as I became more established and I could choose my own textbooks, I noticed that students were doing the same thing that I was doing in college. They were borrowing each other's, copying pages. I would hand out copies if I had them, and I got really frustrated, and I could see that it was really difficult for them to afford them. So I started just using resources off the internet. This is before I knew what OER was. So I'm like, okay, well, here's a link to a video, and here's, and I just, because I'm like, everything you need to know is already on the internet. So why should I have to make them pay for a $75 book? And I did that for a couple of years, and then it got introduced to OER because we were starting our initiative and they needed somebody to help with it. So they asked me to help with it. And I didn't know much about it, but I started going to conferences and doing all that. And I really fell in love with it. It was definitely difficult to convince faculty to do it initially, but so many of them have come on board now. And probably the best experience I've had is that Dr. Palmer and we co-wrote a textbook called The Rough Writer's Guide. I think she mentioned it. And it's like this huge resource with everything you can imagine for a student to write an essay. And it's been viewed quite a bit, and it was a lot of work. We use Pressbooks. Pressbooks is great, but I think now that we've done it and got the hang of it, it's a little bit quicker now when we want to create resources. But just hearing the students' stories has been really great. So. Yeah.
Awesome, that's great. Thank you so much. Already, I'm jumping off of script because so many cool themes I think are emerging from all of this, from everybody having sort of a personal investment from experiences or really formative opportunities, which I just think is remarkable. But also I'm struck by, and this is kind of what I want to hone in on right now, I'm struck by the logistics and the logistical benefits around OER, because I think oftentimes we think about the stumbling blocks, the difficulty in finding resources, how to incorporate them. And I think just about everybody mentioned that there are immediate sort of logistical benefits to adopting OER and using those. So let's explore that a little bit more. And anybody can jump in on this, or I can pick somebody if we need to get started. But talk a little bit about how OER has impacted kind of the flow and shape and design of your course, in terms of how the students experience that, how you experience that, even beyond just the ease of not having to update, new editions of textbooks and everything.
Well, one of the things that we found at our school is that we never were really happy with our liberal arts textbook. We get one and we're like, well, we like this part. We like this part of this book. We like this part of this book. We never liked any one book. And I came up with this idea. Actually, two of us were driving back from Phoenix one day and said, what if we did this? And so we came up with this great idea. We put it to the department, and we all decided we'd write a book that would be addressing exactly what we wanted and what pieces we want to have in it. That's given us so much freedom to actually say things. And then just recently, the state, our math ATF just approved a new curriculum for our liberal arts math class. And we actually then had to change our textbook. And it wasn't like going and looking for a new textbook. We added a few problems in another section in a chapter. It was a piece of cake. It was not this major undertaking of looking for a textbook that would have everything we wanted. We just added more problems in. So it was so convenient, and the book is now out there for the students to use.
For my classes, I keep like everything on Canvas because that's the type of person I am, but it makes it, you know, using OER, I can have exactly, you know, the link I want in each module, in each section, and say, you know, okay, I want this chapter from this book, but I don't really like their chapter on, you know, culture shock. So I'm gonna, you know, put the reading from this other OER resource in for the culture shock one. So, you know, I'm not beholden to the one book. I can pull from a whole bunch of different things and make sure that it's like, okay, this is exactly what I want to teach. But then it also gives the students, like, because sometimes I'll put alternate links in, like, if you didn't really like this reading, or if it was hard for you to understand, here's one that talks about a similar concept, just in a slightly different way. But it also makes it easy for me to do like my lecture videos, because when I put stuff in Canvas, I make sure that, you know, if students are out sick, or if I'm out sick, there's always lecture videos in with it. And I license those Creative Commons on YouTube. So they're also available there for students to watch any lecture videos I make, but it just makes my class flow really easy because everything's already there online. You know, I've made PowerPoint slides and I've made a video that are all OER and, you know, Creative Commons licensed, that people can just go through and go boom, 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 boom.
For my classes, I feel like not having the textbook removed the pressure of me feeling like they needed to read the whole thing, even though not all of it applied to my learning outcomes specifically, because I always felt like they spent $150 on this, they should probably read it all. And if the textbook served to pace my course rather than the learning outcomes. And so I think for my classes, a lot of that like fluff has been removed. And then I've been able to provide other resources and a diversity of voices. So like in my cultural diversity and education class, I found a chapter from a sociology textbook that's perfect. And then we can look at it from a sociological perspective and then talk about it from an educational perspective. It also just helped me clean up my classes in general and realize how much I relied on the textbook when I shouldn't have been to drive the instruction. And then I think the resources too, the links we give them, they can save those and access them forever. And in the past, I took a lot of, I think, important stuff out because I knew they were overwhelmed with just getting through the textbook. So now we explore Arizona Department of Education's website a lot more thoroughly. And we, you know, take the time to look at other things that I think will be more meaningful. And then it's also encouraged me to put more on the students to do things like go find resources in their community and stuff like that. And then the last thing I was going to say is that there's a lot of Creative Commons and OER stuff out there, so much more than I think most people realize. It's hard, it can be difficult to find it, but once you do, there's a lot of, like I found these modules that somebody created that I have my students go through, and they have videos embedded and all kinds of great things. And it's stuff that they wouldn't have gotten nearly as much out of if they have just read a chapter out of the textbook.
So for me, because I put everything into a textbook, that made sense to my brain. But what I used to have is in my classes and the modules, I'd have, you know, okay, read this portion of your textbook. Now watch this video and, you know, then do this. And what I did is I put all of that into the textbook. So now I just have to tell students, because it's online on Pressbooks, read this chapter, and they can do the reading and watch the video, and it's all in one spot for them. So I feel like it makes it a little bit more seamless, and it combines it together in the order that that it makes sense, rather than, you know, them saying, oh, I'm just going to watch the video. Oh, wait, now I've got to go back and read the text, or I've got to do this exercise or whatever. It's logical order. So they're actually going through the material in the way that makes the most sense to build the concepts for them, instead of, when you put things in Canvas, sometimes they just kind of click around. And for years, I had to figure out, and I'm still working through this, students like to just click on the assignment and do the assignment without looking at any of the instruction. So hopefully they're at least reading the textbook and getting some ideas from there. So I put a lot of important information about the assignments also in the textbook so that it hopefully drives them there. And I send them those reminders, make sure you look at the textbook because it's going to have this example and this video that will be really helpful. So I think it streamlines that experience for them and makes it feel like less work, even though they're still doing kind of the same things as before. It feels like it's less work because it's just one thing to do instead of 5 different things to do.
Yeah, and Micah, I know we're going to be short on time for this panel, so my colleagues did a wonderful job answering the questions, and I do all of that as well. And so I'll just pass if you don't mind.
No, that's totally fine. Totally
Micah,
fine.
can I mention one more thing though?
Please, absolutely.
One thing is that we liked is that we also created a co-requisite course to go along with our college math course, and so we were able to find open source videos that were already created that we could then give to our students to teach them material for the co-requisite material. And we also found it was Scottsdale Community College actually, and we were able to use their material also to create group work assignments for the students to work on and homework assignments. And that's been very convenient for them. But another thing I think that's also very important that we don't think about as much is we have dual enrollment classes at our high schools, and public education in the state can't afford to buy new textbooks all the time, can't afford their textbooks when they do have them. With the open source book, it frees up money for them also.
Oh, that's so great. One of the things I think is remarkable about each of those answers in a variety of ways, right, and this is the instructional designer in me coming out, but is the way in which all of those answers ultimately are about connecting students to the resources, whether that's, the diversity of resources from textbooks that they wouldn't read from otherwise, whether that's real world, resources on websites, or just the ease and facilitation of being able to navigate through the content. I feel like that's a really remarkable benefit that comes out of that. Now let's turn 180 degrees though and get real about some of the challenges and obstacles that come with trying to adopt OER. So what are some of the big obstacles that you faced early on in getting going with this, or that you faced at any point in getting going with this? And what are ways that you tried to overcome those, you did overcome those, you are overcoming those, but talk a little bit about some of the challenges and obstacles that you face.
Yeah, I think for challenges are different in this with OER in different stages, I guess, because when you first start, you don't know where to find anything. And then once you know where things are, you're kind of past that. But I think some of the challenges that are really bigger ones that I've noticed when I worked as the liaison is how much time it takes to create these textbooks. So if your institution doesn't provide a stipend, it's hard to feel motivated to want to do it because it is time consuming and takes a lot of work. If there's not a lot of textbooks out there in your field, if you have a very kind of narrowed field and you need to spend time writing your own textbook, that's going to take you all summer, and so just trying to get those grants and trying to get your institution to support you, I think is really important.
I want to agree with Sandy so much on that one. I actually had a sabbatical to write my stats textbook because I didn't have time to write one during the semester. But it's not just getting it up front. I now am trying to update the textbooks, and we're updating other things, and having time to do that is also a problem. And you may also, just like in any textbook, you adopt a book and you think this is the one you want, and then you think, oh, I want to add some things to it. So you have to have the time to go look for it. So that's where the stipends are nice. But also, if you can get sabbaticals to do those, that's also a very nice thing to have. So then you have the time.
Yeah, I'm lucky. I guess I have no room to complain because I've never created a textbook. I've always found stuff or chunks of things from cobbled them together. But even sometimes, like when you go into Canvas Commons and you try to copy a course over, you start looking around and you're like, this organization doesn't make sense to me. Like, or some of our textbooks, and this may be specific to ECE, but we have licensing standards. So the textbook I used was from California, so I had to go back through and change all the licensing standards. But I guess that's the beauty of OER, is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can just adapt, but you sometimes don't know how long it's going to end up taking, and what materials you think will be out there you can't find, and then you'll come across something, you're like, an early childhood curriculum class, there's a textbook for that. That's the last textbook I would have thought somebody would have created, but they created that before family and community partnership, you know, things like that. So I guess when you start looking around, don't assume anything, just be very open and use really broad search terms, because there's stuff out there. It's just a matter of finding it.
I second all the stuff on time, because like for communication, oddly enough, not a huge, at least a couple of years ago when I first started getting like looking for OER stuff for communication, not a huge pool to pull from. And I've also never written my own textbook, but just the time that it takes, like if you write your own, yeah, a lot of time, but just even adapting a class from previously using a, you know, commercial textbook like McGraw-Hill and then moving it over to OER, because, you know, it's not just the textbook, it's any PowerPoints and slides that you had in there. It's any videos that you had taken, you know, from McGraw-Hill that they provided you with. It's any of the test banks. You have to redo all your test banks, and any projects that were like specifically tailored toward that, you know, textbook. You have to rework those. So it's like, okay, well, the OER text I'm using, you know, they don't talk about this particular aspect. So if I ask a question about that or do a project that has that part of it, I have to take that out or rework it into something that more fits up to what the students are actually reading about nowadays. So, you know, just that whole kind of course redesign, which, you know, just time.
Yeah, and just one word of caution, if you do like copy somebody else's quizzes over or something, double check them, because sometimes they update their editions and then their tests don't align with the one you're using. And you can see in Canvas that there have been updates sometimes, but you don't know necessarily what those updates are. So I think it's still not a well-oiled machine.
That's great. Let me ask a little bit about encountering and engaging OER in the process, not just of searching, but evaluating and making decisions about what kinds of resources you want to include. What are you looking for when you encounter it? Do you start with standards before you start looking? Do you develop them as you're looking? And I'm thinking both in terms of you know, just looking at textbooks if you're trying to adopt a textbook, or how do you get to the point where you're looking in diverse disciplines all of a sudden, and pulling things from all over the place. So talk a little bit about the kind of creative element that goes into choosing and picking the OER that you want to use in your courses.
So I, because I created so many textbooks, I feel like it's kind of like creating a class. So when you're starting out with a class, you start out with your outcomes and you kind of work backwards, right? Like, okay, here are the things that my students need to be able to do by the end of the class. Here's how I'm going to assess those things. Here's how here's the practice that they need to be able to do those assessments. And here's the reading that they need to be able to do the practice, to do the assessments, to do the outcomes. And so you kind of have to do the same thing with your textbook. So like when Sandy and I were doing the Rough Rider's Guide, we kind of thought through, okay, what do students need to have? How do we want to organize this? And organized it. And it was a lot, very similar to that course creation process, designing your curriculum and figuring out how you're going to teach a concept. So as far as standards, that's how I start, is with the outcomes and go backwards, just like when I'm designing a class. But I think this kind of ties into the last question too, is the other part of that is the standards with the materials that you find. Are they, you know, meeting your standards? And when I first started looking into OER, one of the resources that was recommended to me had chapters that were one sentence and had grammatical errors. And I was like, wow, OER is horrible. And then I was like, Sandy was like, no, Karen, just keep looking. And so I did, and I found some really great things. And I think what I came to is there were a lot of things like my rhetoric textbook. We have this really amazing philosophy professor at Yavapai, and our fields kind of cross when it comes to rhetoric. And so I thought about, should I have him read this? Oh no, he's going to pick it apart. And so I have this kind of insecurity about this book that I created, but I have to remind myself, okay, so I took these resources that maybe weren't up to, my exact standards, and I hopefully made them better. And then someone could take what I created and hopefully make it better. And by the end, with all of us making it better, which coming from an English background, that's peer review, right? The whole writing process is what I hope that this does, is as we all work together, we can keep making these resources better and better. And so you have to kind of remove that. At least I did for myself. I had to be willing to do my best and put that out there and know, okay, I can keep making it better and other people can make it better. And ultimately, that's what's amazing for students.
Yeah, and for me, it was more when I was reviewing resources, even though I have a doctorate, I have a very short attention span myself. So I would open up somebody's textbook and it was just long text, like no visuals, no nothing. And I was like, if I'm not going to look at this, certainly my students aren't going to look at this, right? So I tended to look or be more interested in materials that had more visuals, video links, anything like that, or made it user-friendly to read, because that way it was easier for me to adapt those for our own textbook and for my own classes.
I don't know if I have anything to add on this one. I think the same thing is when we look for textbooks, we look at our content, we see whether the textbook provides our content. And then I think about open sources. If you like the textbook, but it doesn't give you all your content, you can find another one that will give you that part of the content that's missing. So that's kind of what we look for when we're looking for books.
Yeah, I think OER has made us think more about our learning outcomes instead of being textbook driven, it being learning outcome driven. And that's helped me really identify what kinds of assessments, and like it's impacted the whole range of building a class and executing a class. And most of my classes, I found one great textbook that covers, 80% of it. And then I add some stuff here and there. But the cultural diversity and education class was one where I never actually found a textbook that fit, but I found chunks of, like I said, sociology, psychology, some curriculum, and I kind of coddled it together. And I mean, it's working. I've gotten great feedback from my students. And again, I feel like it's that variety of voices that helps them too, especially in a social science class like that, where that's valued. I mean, someday I'll get it together enough like Karen and Sandy and create my own textbook with all of those materials, depending on how they're licensed. But that's the beauty of it, right? Like Sandy said, if you find one that has the content, but it's really dry, if it's licensed in a way that you can mess with it, then you can go in and add those links and those pictures. And that's still way easier than starting from scratch.
Yeah, and like everybody else said, just, does it meet our course objectives and our learning objectives for the course? If yes, use it. If it needs a little bit of updating, update it, make it a little more user-friendly, a little bit design-friendly or aesthetically pleasing as needed, and just based on student feedback, adapt.
Oh, that's so great. I think that a couple of you said the A word and the others of you got pretty close in talking about outcomes and objectives. So let's be explicit about assessing your students and student learning and the ways in which OER has impacted or not your approach to assessments in your courses.
It has made me a lot more creative, but granted, as like a communication professor, I tend to have a lot of creative freedom anyways, because it's, it's not like math or whatever where, there is one right answer to things. With communication, there's a variety of right answers. So my classes have, like, previously for previous professors, like they gave me like test banks and stuff, and I've pretty much kind of done away with that. But now my students do like a whole bunch of just projects, and it's like, well, you've learned about these different things. Now it's time to apply it in, like, one of my classes right now, they're doing a film for small group communication, and they're like, we want to talk about conflict management. It's like, okay, here is a whole bunch of OER conflict management stuff. Here's some stuff about filmmaking. These are the standards you have to meet. Have at it.
I'd say for me personally, I don't think OER has changed how I do this. I always would, with my statistics class, I don't like to have it graded by an online homework system. So I would grade it all myself. The nice thing is that the questions are now ones that I'm more interested in and are more about data and not just about, here's some summary statistics, tell me what the mean's doing. It's more about coming up with it and seeing what's happening. So I see that my textbook's more of, because of the way I wrote it, is more about being more data centric in my statistics class. In our math, our college math course, we actually use an online homework system. And I actually do know that some people have written an online homework system for my stats course through Lumen. I don't use it, but I know others have used it. But in our 140 class, we actually are using, in our 142 class, we're actually using Derivata, which is, you have to pay for, it's like $35 a semester to pay for access to the class. So we don't think that that's a lot of money considering the book is free for the students. And that we are using in that class. And the nice thing about that is it's not tied to a textbook. So we can, because we're no longer tied to a textbook, we can actually go pick, we like this problem instead of that problem, and we want this concept instead of that concept. So we were able to pick and mix and match the problems in there, as opposed to what you have in a regular textbook where you're just doing what the publisher wants you to do.
I think it's a strangely like psychological thing, but once you give up your tie to a textbook, somehow you also give up that you have to have PowerPoints and traditional quizzes, and it just kind of makes the whole process more creative. And if they're using different types of sources, then you can evaluate them differently. And that, I think that's probably more interesting for students. Like Sandy, when I was grading the same thing over and over and I was getting bored of grading it, I figured they're probably bored of doing it. So it's allowed me to feel better about being more creative.
So one of the things that I was encouraged to do at some point was to try to get students doing some OER stuff. And so I think that's one of the things that I've added to some of my classes is I have them doing wikis. So instead of just like trying to learn about all of these names, so in rhetoric, they have to learn, all this history. And so instead of having them try to study all of it, I have them put together a wiki. So then they're looking at what everyone else is saying, and they're, trying to put videos in. And another class, I think I have them do that with videos, that they have to go find a video and link to that and talk about it. And so it lets them be a little bit more creative, and they're still learning the same stuff, but in a different way. So I think that it makes it more fun, but that's something that's changed for me. I mean, I teach writing and stuff, so you have to write a paper because that's part of the course outcomes, but so they can't change too much, but that has been something fun that I've been able to add.
Something that I didn't anticipate when I started doing OERs, like when you go into the Commons and you find a class that you can copy over, you get to see how other people teach the same big classes you're teaching. And I've gotten a lot of great ideas from other instructors for project-based learning and things like that, and what their rubrics look like. And just that alone, because I'm kind of a lone ranger here, there's only one education faculty. So that alone has been really nice, just to see how other people do things.
One thing I also want to mention is I give take-home tests in my stats class, and because I'm no longer tied to a publisher's textbook, I go look for data sets out there in the world, and then I bring those data sets in my class, and they're huge data sets, and I then have my students take their own samples. So even their take-home tests, every single student has their own sample. And so you know that they can't really talk with each other about it. I mean, they can talk about how they're analyzing it, but they can't actually get the same answers because the data sets are out there that we can look for.
And I know this has already been mentioned, but we can, you know, with having a live book, breathing book that you can constantly change. If I have an assessment that didn't work, I'll just change it. That happens a lot. Yeah.
I love how much of this conversation is focused on creativity, whether it's inviting students to be creative through assessments and through the material, or opportunities for faculty folks to be creative in a variety of ways. I think that's a really remarkable thing. We're getting near to the end of our time, and I've certainly got plenty more questions that I feel like I could spend another 30 or 40 minutes asking questions. But I want to open it up, or I have opened it up, and I want to call attention to if anyone has questions that they would like to hear from the panel or from panelists. Put those into the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. While we're waiting on those, though, one question I want to ask is related to assessment, but in a more sort of concrete way. What are some of the student responses and student outcomes that you have encountered or experienced? And those can be on a broad scale in terms of, you know, the way students perform in courses, or that can be in kind of personalized ways. What are things that students have said to you or demonstrated to you? Because ultimately, of course, that's what we're doing here, is impacting the learning experiences of students. And so talk a little bit about some of that.
For me, one thing that's been really neat is, and I didn't discuss this when we talked about what's difficult about OER, but I use this example all the time at my college. We teach literature, and not always old literature that's new, and that's copyrighted. So we can't use those materials to make our classes OER. So what we'll do a lot is we'll do a flipped classroom, where we, rather than tell the students, hey, I want you to go read this story, I say, I want you to go pick out a story on, you know, go find a story yourself, and I'll have the parameters. And I think that gives them ownership. It helps them find something that they're going to be interested in. And it also provides research skills, right? I'm not doing it for them. I'm having them do it. So I think that that's one of the biggest surprises I've had, is those positive outcomes, that they've actually learned to enjoy whatever it is they're reading or writing about, because I turned it around like that.
Similarly, in my classes, I've had them doing a lot more observation of young children, and that they've really responded well to that. Because, you know, like I said, when you have this great big long textbook that you feel like you have to get through, you don't want to burden them with one more thing, but the value of reading it is not always the best way. And there's a ton of great podcasts out there too. But student feedback has been really positive, just not having to worry about books, not having to, you know, our students around scholarships, like buy the book and save the receipt and go to the business office and all the stuff in between. But seeing as my students haven't taken the textbook version, it would be nice if we had somebody who maybe failed it when we did it with the textbook and took it with OER, so we could see, you know, if they could compare and contrast for us. But overall, I've gotten really good feedback in our OER sections.
My students, they like that they have less, like, you know, multiple choice tests or whatever. But just giving them ownership and having kind of like them choose their own adventure. Kimberly asked me in the chat, what text courses or assignments have I found that are my favorite? So I like my really small classes, because I can do some, you know, really fun projects with that. Like I said, my small group communication class right now, there's 4 of them. And, you know, I gave them an assignment. It's like, look, you guys are building your own exam for, you know, week 12 or whatever. So you have to decide what your learning outcomes are going to be based on the things that we've talked about and that we've learned about. You get to decide if it's a test, an exam, or a video or whatever. But I like to have a lot of those kind of like alternate assignments where it's, you know, not just writing a paper, like, yes, if we have an assignment that says, you're writing a paper over whatever, if you want to do it in podcast form, do it if that's how you learn better. But being able to have that freedom on my end makes it more interesting to grade, but then allowing the students to say, okay, well, if we're in communication theories class, talk about whatever theory is interesting to you, because that's the point of it, is to facilitate your learning. I know about these comm theories. I don't need everyone writing about social penetration if you don't care about social penetration theory at all. But just, giving them that ownership and letting them say, okay, well, what do I want to learn about? What's important to me and my future within the context of the things that we have been learning about?
I don't think things have changed for when I went to a publisher textbook to an OER textbook in my classes, which actually speaks good for OER, because I don't think it's actually done anything. There's not like my students are doing worse because of it. I do get my students saying to me, thank you for not having us have to buy a book. And I watched a student one day handing out money to pay for her classes and counting out every dollar. And when she was told, you now have to buy a parking pass, the look on her face was just devastating. And I couldn't imagine what she was going to think when she had to go to class and find out she has to go buy textbooks now on top of it. So I think that to me is the most important piece, is that they don't have to spend a lot of money to take the class.
Yeah, and I think that's so one of the things. I'm the OER faculty facilitator this year for OER at Yavapai, and so I help administer the student survey, and the comments that students give us about how this has helped them, that they were able to buy groceries and and
Looks like we may have lost Dr. Palmer again, but I do want to be mindful of our time, because we are coming up to the minute where we are supposed to stop. But this has been, at least for me, such a fantastic conversation. So thank you to each of the panelists for being willing to share your experiences and your insight and your wisdom about these things. And then I assume that if anybody has questions that they would like to follow up with, they can put those in the chat, or they can reach out to me or to Megan, and we can get you in touch with relevant folks. And with that, I think, Megan, I will turn it back